Tonight, on All In.
These catch and kill scenarios existed between David Pecker and Mr. Trump long before I started working for him in 2007.
The unnamed witness for the Trump grand jury is revealed, and the man who ran the National Enquirer goes under oath.
David Pecker had done this in other cases of other mistresses or women.
Other circumstances, yes.
Tonight, inquiring minds want to know, what does David Pecker's testimony mean for the timing of a possible Trump indictment? Then Charles' blow on his time in Waco, where the disgraced ex-president's campaign rally turned darker than ever. Plus, an ominous vision from the streets of Tel Aviv of what could happen here if Trump returns to power. Then the desperately sad, predictable response to yet another nightmare school shooting, this time in Tennessee, when All In starts right now. Good evening from Washington, D.C. I'm Mehdi Hassan, in for Chris Hayes. It's been 9 days since Donald Trump said he was going to be arrested, quote, on Tuesday. It's been nearly a week since last Tuesday came and went without a word from the Manhattan DA's office. And it's been a matter of hours since the grand jury investigating the ex-president's hush money payment to Stormy Daniels heard from yet another key witness. But we are still waiting to learn whether or not an actual indictment will be handed down this week. There was much speculation that Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg wanted the jurors to hear from an additional witness after he cancelled last Wednesday's session. And today that speculation was confirmed. David Pecker, a Trump ally and the former publisher of the National Enquirer, testified before the grand jury for the second time today. Pecker, you may remember, helped broker the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels, which Daniels says was to cover up an affair she had with Trump shortly after his youngest son was born. Under Pecker's tenure at the National Enquirer, the tabloid made a habit of purchasing and subsequently burying negative stories about Trump to help his campaign during the 2016 election. Back in 2021, the Enquirer's parent company was fined nearly $200,000 by the Federal Election Commission for squashing a story about a different reported Trump affair, this time with Playboy model Karen McDougal. The Enquirer says it worked in concert with the Trump campaign when it paid McDougal to keep quiet about what she says was a months-long relationship. The Enquirer also infamously spread negative stories about Trump's opponents in an attempt to help then-candidate Trump, like when the tabloid baselessly claimed that Republican Senator Ted Cruz's father was linked to the JFK assassination. Sorry, that one still makes me laugh. And to make it all worse, after all Pecker did for Trump, according to Michael Cohen, the ex-president stiffed him.
He was supposed to pay. He was supposed to pay $125,000 for the life story of Karen McDougal. For whatever the reason may be, he elected not to pay it. David Pecker was very angry because there was also other monies that David had expended on his behalf. Unfortunately, David never got paid back for that either.
So David Pecker had done this in other cases of other mistresses or women?
Other circumstances, yes.
So David Pecker may not be Trump's biggest fan. He previously testified back in January, shortly after the Manhattan grand jury was convened. And he could prove an invaluable witness for the prosecution, considering his proximity to this case. For his part, the ex-president spent today the same way he spends most days, lashing out against the investigation on social media. Apparently, he didn't get it all out of his system during his rally in Waco, Texas, over the weekend.
This is really prosecutorial misconduct. That's what it's called. The innocence of people makes no difference whatsoever to these radical left maniacs. The district attorney of New York, under the auspices and direction of the Department of Injustice in Washington, D.C., was investigating me for something that is not a crime, not a misdemeanor, not an affair.
Here in Washington, Trump's sycophants in Congress are once again trying to weasel their way into D.A. Bragg's investigation. Over the weekend, House Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, including, of course, Committee Chair Jim Jordan, him, sent a second letter to Bragg's office. They are once again demanding access to the documents and testimony from the New York investigation. Although, as Bragg's office and others have noted, they have no legal basis to access such information. The Manhattan DA dismissed the demand in a public statement on Saturday that read in part, quote, "The unprecedented inquiry by federal elected officials into an ongoing matter serves only to hinder, disrupt, and undermine the legitimate work of our dedicated prosecutors." Of course, hinder, disrupt, and undermine this investigation is exactly what Trump and his allies want to do. But so far, it seems, their efforts have come to naught. For more on the latest developments out of the Manhattan DA's office, I'm joined by Jonathan Dienst, Chief Justice Contributor for NBC News and Chief Investigative Reporter for WNBC in New York. Jonathan, thanks for coming on the show. What more do we know about what happened today?
I think the main headline coming out of today is that the grand jury, we're told from several sources, did not vote. It was not asked to vote, which means Wednesday is the next day they could convene. But it's unclear if so far they're being asked to come back on Wednesday to convene, to consider hearing testimony or any arguments from prosecutors. All this after David Pecker was called in today. He was questioned for about an hour and a half. The grand jury starts around 2. We're told he left around 3:30 today. And again, he was called in, we believe, to try to counter the Trump witness, the pro-Trump witness, Robert Costello, who went in and tried to poke holes in the testimony by Michael Cohen, who alleges Donald Trump played a key role in this alleged scheme. Again, Donald Trump denies all wrongdoing, the investigation ongoing, and of course, the DA taking step by step, day by day, this investigation. Unclear when they might decide to charge or to go forward with charges.
So is Pecker the last witness before a possible indictment, or could there be others, do we know?
We know there have been numerous witnesses that this is near the tail end of this investigation because the DA's office reached out to Donald Trump and said, you have the opportunity now to come in and testify. He chose not to, and he sent in the attorney, Robert Costello, to testify on his behalf. So that is a sign that this investigation is coming to an end. You also remember about a week and a half ago, we began reporting that law enforcement agencies, from the FBI to court officers to the NYPD, et cetera, had been advised that an indictment could be coming and they need to begin making preparations for security here in the city and beyond. So that was another tangible example. Now, whether it was Robert Costello's testimony that may have poked some holes in Michael Cohen's story. Remember, Michael Cohen is a convicted felon and has a history of lying, but he has been interviewed about 20 times by the DAs, and he's been in front of that grand jury telling his story. He testified in front of Congress. So the question now is, how strong a case does the DA think he has, and when and if is he going to move forward?
That is the big question. Jonathan Dienst, thank you for your reporting. Appreciate it. Tim O'Brien is the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. Karen Friedman Agnifalo served as the chief assistant district attorney in the Manhattan DA's office. Both join me now. Karen, back in 2019, Michael Cohen testified that Trump and Pecker had a lengthy relationship. Have a listen.
I was involved in several of these catch and kill episodes, but these catch and kill scenarios existed between David Pecker and Mr. Trump long before I started working for him in 2007.
Karen, explain to us the significance of David Pecker, in your view, coming back to testify again to the grand jury today.
Yeah, so there isn't a lot of question of fact here about whether or not payments were made. That's all going to be proven by books and records, including the fact that these payments that were made, 11 of them while Trump was sitting president, were made and false entries were made into business records indicating that these were legal retainers. The question that is really for the grand jury to decide is, was Trump involved in these payments? Did he know about them? Did he know about the purpose? Did he know that these were false entries in the books and records, as well as whether this was to cover up, whether this was to affect the election, right? So those are the two questions that the jury has. And Michael Cohen testified yes to both of those, right? That Trump was involved and that this was in order to influence the election. And as we know, Michael Cohen comes with some baggage and needs to be corroborated. And Robert Costello highlighted that baggage for the grand jury. And David Pecker testified, I think, over 3 months ago in the grand jury. And that's a long time ago. And he can be the one to corroborate both of those facts. He can say, of course, Donald Trump knew and was involved. And in fact, I was doing this because he wanted me to catch and kill these stories. And yes, it was because of the election, et cetera. And so I think the significance is, if there was any question whether or not Alvin Bragg was going to seek an indictment, this tells me that, yes, he's going to ask the grand jury to vote one way or another. He's not going to pull back, and he's not going to not bring this case. He's going to ask the grand jury to vote this case. And I think it'll be potentially this week, since Donald Trump is in New York this week. And for security reasons, I think they're going to want to do that around the time that he's already here.
Tim, I want to ask you about David Pecker, but given what Karen just said, I have to ask you. If Donald Trump is getting arrested this week after his false claim of being arrested last week, if he's getting indicted this week, you know the man. You've been in legal proceedings with the man. What is going through his head right now?
Well, I think he's deeply afraid. Everything. I think there's two things motivating what he's doing right now. Most of every Donald Trump action can either be explained through a lens of self-aggrandizement or self-preservation. He is clearly in self-preservation mode. I think watching Alan Weisselberg, his former CFO, get fingerprinted and perp-walked and handcuffed in front of the media for someone who thrives and needs the media for sustenance. The last thing he wants to be is humiliated in front of the media in a courtroom. And I think he is deeply afraid of that. I think he's also very well aware at this point that even if the institutional Republican Party doesn't fully support him, the far-right MAGA wing of the party does. And he has not hesitated to invoke violence, either by calling for the mob to march in the street or to take a photo of himself holding a baseball bat next to a picture of Alvin Bragg. Again, this is somebody who feels cornered and he's lashing out. It's also what makes him every lawyer's worst nightmare for a client, because the client you'd want in this situation would just keep his mouth shut and not try to intrude on the process. But that's not Donald Trump. I also think there's a political calculation. I think this case, among the four, I think, most potent ones that are in investigations that are leveled at him right now, is possibly maybe the least perilous for him. But I think he is trying to set the stage for all of them to be baseless by going after this one first.
And Karen, Tim mentioned going after it. He mentioned violence. Trump's threats against Bragg, his talk, the baseball bat image, the degenerate psychopath, death and destruction, all of the stuff he's been saying over the last 7 to 10 days. Is that illegal? Can you call that incitement, or is it just free speech?
So a lot of what he says is free speech. But when he did that, when he held the baseball bat to Alvin Bragg's head next to each other, and he called within hours, also talked about death and destruction. There will be death and destruction in the streets. To me, that went from speech to conduct. And at that point, given his history of January 6th and he knows what his supporters will do when he says things like stand back and stand by and go march, and all the things he said on January 6th, and then caused the insurrection to happen and then didn't call anyone off. Him saying that there's going to be death and destruction in the streets is a dog whistle to his MAGA supporters. And as far as I'm concerned, at that point, it went into its conduct. And he is guilty, I would say, of several different New York misdemeanors. I was shocked that I scoured the penal law over the weekend and there's no felony, but he is certainly guilty of at least 3 misdemeanors. Whether the Manhattan DA's office chooses to bring those cases is another story. But if they wanted to, they absolutely could. He crossed a bright red line, and he should be held accountable.
Quick last question to you, Tim. Michael Cohen, David Pecker, Trump uses these intermediaries and then they turn on him because he treats them so badly. Does he get that he's his own worst enemy?
I don't think he cares if he's his own worst enemy. He basically is only focused on what's in front of him for about 5 minutes. He is not a strategist. He is not a long-term thinker. We talked about this before, Mehdi. Anytime there's the word strategy appears next to his name in a story or a headline, it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how he rolls. He is a reptilian survivor. And everything that he does is geared towards his own self-interest and no one else's. The other thing to remember in this case, by the way, is that there is a tape. Michael Cohen taped Donald Trump telling him and directing him to go to Alan Weisselberg to handle the cover-up payment.
Reptilian survivor, there's a phrase for the ages. Tim O'Brien, Karen Friedman-Agnifilo, thank you both.
Thank you.
Coming up, as a potential indictment of Donald Trump looms, the question remains, how do you prosecute a former president? Andrew Weissman, a former prosecutor, joins me to break it down next. As the likely indictment of Donald Trump looms, the country is left wondering, how do you actually prosecute a former president? My next guest tackles that unprecedented question head-on in a new podcast miniseries for MSNBC titled Prosecuting Donald Trump. It's hosted by Andrew Weissman, who spent 20 years at the Justice Department, including as the deputy to Robert Mueller during his investigation into the ex-president, and by Mary McCord, a veteran federal prosecutor who helped conduct the Capitol security review following the January 6th insurrection. And Andrew Weissman joins me now. Andrew, thanks for coming back on the show. Walk us through the challenges for all these prosecutors in Manhattan, in Fulton County, in the special counsel's office, if they want to charge an ex-president with a crime.
So, there are all sorts of issues. And one of the things you always hear prosecutors say is that the fact that it is the former president or a case that's very high profile doesn't make a difference, that, you follow the facts and the law and you try it like any other case. And that is true to an extent. But Chris Hayes, actually, an homage to him, because he always says, I never believed that. And he has a point, which is that there are ways in which the fact that something is a high profile case or it is a former president can come into play. So let me give you an example. Because it is a former president and this country has never had that situation before, unlike, for instance, Israel, where the current leader is actually under indictment or corruption, or France, where there are other countries that have dealt with this. But we're Americans, we tend not to look at international examples. But you do have to think about the educational function that the prosecutor needs to play. And what I mean by that is making sure that people understand that this is not selective prosecution, or to phrase it as the former president would, a witch hunt, that this is actually an application of the rule of law, that other people who did similar things are treated the same way, and actually not to prosecute him would be to accord him extra weight and extra benefits that no one else does. So that's one way. Another way in which just prosecuting any high-profile case can be a real challenge is obtaining the cooperation of witnesses who did something wrong. So imagine, Mehdi, if you were somebody who'd done something wrong and I was trying to get you to cooperate, you would not only have to admit to yourself and your family and friends that you did something wrong, but you'd have to be willing to have it splattered all over the New York Times and the Washington Post and cable news day in and day out. And that can make it really challenging for a prosecutor who's trying to gain cooperation. And then obviously we've seen the problem of dealing with Congress, where you have just a lot of incoming that you wouldn't have in a normal case.
Yeah, just on the jury point, I guess there's a specific jury point in relation to Trump, which is nothing to do with him being a former president, but everything to do with him being a kind of wannabe mob boss in terms of intimidation of jurors. You've got the E. Jean Carroll defamation case now, where the judge last week said the jurors will stay anonymous because of threats to their life.
Absolutely.
That is America in 2023. And that's nothing to do with prosecuting a former president. I'm sure if you prosecuted Bill Clinton or Barack Obama for a crime, you wouldn't have to worry about the safety of the jurors. That's a Trump-specific issue. Let me ask you this, Andrew. What is your big picture takeaway of the Manhattan DA's investigation right now? We just started the show talking about the latest there. Barbara McQuaid says she thinks David Pecker may have been brought in as a rebuttal witness to the pro-Trump attorney Robert Costello's testimony before the grand jury last week.
Yeah, so I take it as a life lesson to never disagree with Barb McQuaid. I've worked with her here at MSNBC and at the Department of Justice, and I actually agree with her. One of the things that David Pecker is really on record doing is making it clear that to the extent that Costello tried to tell the grand jury that this was all Michael Cohen's idea and he was the one who came up with the scheme and it wasn't known or approved by the former president or anyone else, David Pecker is on record saying that's not true. He understood the scheme and actually has said as part of his agreement with the government that this was something that was sort of a catch and kill program and started with Karen McDougal. And so that would go, I think, a long way to rebutting the testimony of Mr. Costello to the extent that's what he said to the grand jurors. And I also agree with Karen, who's incredibly knowledgeable, that I think that the DA is going to want to have the time between an indictment and an arraignment be as short as possible because of security concerns. That just seems, having been involved in a case with security concerns, that is something you take incredibly seriously.
Yeah. And one last question to you, Andrew. We have some developments out of Fulton County, Georgia today as well. Trump's lawyers are trying to throw out that grand jury report into 2020 election interference there and to block Fulton County DA Fani Willis from investigating Trump further. Today, a Georgia judge ordered Willis to respond to their concerns. What do you make of that? I hate to ask this question. Is there really any merit to Trump's claims?
Well, ordering a response it's normal to have a date by which you have to respond. I actually took it as more important that the date that Fani Willis was given was, I think, May 1st. I think that's the more important part, because that is a lot of time. If the judge thought this was anything important, it would have been a lot sooner than that. I think especially because this was just an investigating grand jury and not the grand jury that would indict. I don't think there's any merit to the motion, and it's also directed at the wrong grand jury. So, again, if you're on the defense side, you're supposed to make these kinds of motions. So I don't fault them for making good faith motions, but I don't think this is anything that we have to worry about.
Andrew Weissman, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. And Andrew's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, is now available wherever you get your podcasts. Still ahead, President Biden calls for a ban on assault weapons after 6 people, including 3 kids, are killed in a Nashville school. What will it take to get concrete gun reform? That's next.
Hey everyone, I'm Tom Llamas from Top Story on NBC News Now. Every night, Top Story is your news playlist. We take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. And now, Top Story is available as a podcast, so you can listen anytime and anywhere. Subscribe now for new episodes every weeknight.
The culture is diverse. The culture is strong and resilient. The culture is AAPI Women. Join MSNBC's Katie Fang as she hosts a dinner party with groundbreaking Asian American and Pacific Islander women who are shaping American culture, featuring political strategist Huma Abedin, award-winning novelist Min-Jin Lee, and an interview with comedian and actress Margaret Cho. The culture is AAPI Women. Sunday at 10 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC and streaming on Peacock.
It's just, it's sick. We're still gathering the facts of what happened and why. And we do know that as of now, there are a number of people who did not make it, including children. The shooter in this situation reportedly had 2 assault weapons and a pistol, 2 AK-47. So I call on Congress again to pass my assault weapons ban. It's about time that we began to make some more progress.
President Biden called for congressional action today after 6 people, including 3 children. 3 kids were shot and killed at a private school in Nashville, Tennessee. Police say the shooter was 28 years old and a former student at the Christian elementary school. They also say the shooter was transgender and are investigating whether identity played any kind of factor in the motive. The shooter was reportedly armed with assault rifles and a pistol and killed 3 school employees and 3 9-year-old children. This was the 130th mass shooting this year alone, according to the Gun Violence Archive. But Republicans are still standing in the way of any meaningful action against gun violence. Last week, in the same state as this latest horrific shooting, the Tennessee State Senate Judiciary Committee approved a Republican-led bill that would expand gun access in the state, making it easier for 18-year-olds to obtain guns and concealed carry. The Republican governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee, signed a bill in 2021 that allows people to openly carry handguns without permits. And over in Georgia, Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene spent today interrogating an ATF officer as to why a Georgia gun store was undergoing a routine inspection. And just last week, right here in Washington, D.C., Republicans held a hearing on gun laws, and when it was interrupted by the parents of a 17-year-old victim of the Parkland, Florida school shooting, the Republican chair had them thrown out.
You took my son away from me, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to listen to your absurd things. Yes.
Why don't you remove him?
Yeah, remove him too.
We all know it. Run it back.
I'm joined now by Manuel Oliver, who is a gun safety advocate and who lost his son Joaquin in the Parkland school shooting. Manuel, thanks so much for coming on the show. You were arrested for protesting at that Republican-led hearing last week in Congress. Today there was this other school shooting. How does it feel seeing more families go through what you went through?
Well, it's the first time that I was, for 3 days in a row, interviewed because of the arrest in D.C., because of complaining and speaking out, trying to prevent these kind of things from happening. And suddenly I keep on getting interviewed, but now it's because it was a school shooting. Another school shooting, 3 kids, 9-year-old, dead. So I'm very frustrated. I think that it's time to try different things. We need to allow ourselves to pump up the volume and disrupt until we find what we're looking for.
And the congressman, the Republican congressman for this district where today's mass shooting happened, Andy Ogles, is a Republican who in 2022 put out this photo as his Christmas card. Have a look. We're going to put it on the screen there. What goes through your head seeing a visual image like this from an elected member of Congress?
Well, he's not the only one, and that's the problem. There's many of them, and I've seen them, and I've been trying to see what they want, what they're looking for. The only answer that I find is that they will always be protecting the gun industry. That's what they did on that hearing. They were complaining about the ATF being very strong on them, which is totally ridiculous and laughable. So I'm afraid we need to react, and we need to call everyone to complain.
And Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene also put out a statement today calling for more, quote, good guys with guns to stop school shootings. You also have Senator Rick Scott of Florida, Republican, tweeting today, and I quote, we need to consider an automatic death penalty, he says, for school shooters. Life in prison is not enough for the deranged monsters who go into our school to kill innocent kids and educators. Personally, I feel like Greene, Scott, these Republicans will do anything to deflect the conversation away from the real cause of this violence, guns.
Well, these are not guns. These are weapons of war, number one. And the death penalty should be a sentence to anyone that is responsible for this. And that goes beyond the shooter itself. We have representatives that have been insisting that no gun laws should be placed out there. And I know that Rick Scott did a lot of things after Parkland, but apparently he was not okay with those bills that we passed a year ago. So there's a lot of contradictions between Republicans and Democrats. And at the end of the day, this is not about red or blue. This is ethical. And now we lost again more people. Thing is that tomorrow we will lose more people. We will have more victims tomorrow if we don't do anything today.
And if you got a call from Joe Biden tonight from the president saying, what should I be doing via executive order? I can't do anything about Congress, but what can I do as president? What would you want him to be doing and saying?
Well, I think President Biden is doing what he's been able to. The president has limited resources here. We need to call, and I started today, calling for a national strike. We need to get people out there. I want to see where the teachers are here. I want to see where the students stand here from all levels of education. The president needs us to get out there. And this is why we have insisted, my wife, Patricia, myself, that our voice on the streets, outside of the buildings of the Capitol Hill or the White House, are as important or more than the voices of those Republicans that are not in any way fighting for the victims of gun violence.
Manuel Oliver, we will have to leave it there. We are so sorry for your loss, and we thank you for appearing on the show tonight.
Thank you very much.
Still to come. Still to come. Actions like Marjorie Taylor Greene's demonizing the ATF are the kind of thing that lead to tragedies like Waco 30 years ago. And that is exactly where Donald Trump went this weekend to stir up his base. That's coming up ahead.
Hi, I'm Jordan Rubin, former prosecutor and legal writer with MSNBC. These days, it seems every news story has a major legal angle to it, whether it's the multiple investigations into Donald Trump, decisions from the Supreme Court that impact our lives, or fallout from the January 6th committee's findings. That's why we've launched Deadline Legal Blog, an online extension of Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace, where I'll be breaking down the legal implications of the stories that are driving the news cycle. Read the latest at msnbc.com/deadlineblog.
CNBC's Last Call podcast. Get the stories behind the numbers.
There's investing news that impacts your money and your portfolio.
And the people behind the business.
And there's business news that impacts your life.
From Wall Street to K Street and Main Street. The markets may close. Your money never stops.
Last Call is really about spotting tomorrow's opportunities tonight.
Brian Sullivan hosts Last Call. Follow and listen to CNBC's Last Call on your favorite podcast platform today.
What would happen if Donald Trump returned to power in January 2025 while in the midst of a criminal trial and then tried to use the power of the state to basically shut down our independent judiciary? Well, you don't have to imagine. Over in Israel, his far-right authoritarian pal, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is on trial for corruption, has been trying to do just that. Netanyahu's far-right government and its proposed reforms to the judiciary, reforms that would give him the power to, among other things, overturn Israeli Supreme Court decisions, have been met with historic protests. On Saturday, for example, 300,000 Israelis took to the streets, which is the equivalent of nearly 10 million Americans turning out to protest here. Today, after weeks of demonstrations, strikes, roads blockaded, diplomats quitting, Israeli military reservists refusing to show up for duty, and criticisms from the international community, including the Biden administration, and after a former Israeli security chief said the country was on the verge of dictatorship, Netanyahu announced a pause. So, victory for democracy? Not quite. Number one, this is Netanyahu, the savviest of savvy politicians, Israel's longest-serving prime minister. The odds are he's just pausing so that the protesters go home, the anger dies down, the world moves on, and then he and his far-right coalition get to just ram it through anyway. Number two, at what cost was this pause achieved? Netanyahu seems to have persuaded his far-right-wing national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, a man once convicted for incitement of racism and support for a terrorist organization, to back the pause by giving him a private police force, his own militia, in return. One that the fascistic Ben-Gvir presumably could use not just to crack down on future anti-government protests inside of Israel, but also to terrorize Palestinians in the occupied territories. And number three, what about the Palestinians? Where do they feature in all of this? Israelis have been admirably and bravely protesting in the streets to save their democracy. A democracy that has never existed for millions of Palestinians who live under direct Israeli control in the West Bank, where Where are the Israeli protests for their freedoms, for their rights, after 56 years of Israeli military occupation? Because there is no saving of Israeli democracy. There is no Israeli democracy without freedom for the occupied Palestinians. It's all connected. As one Israeli woman at a protest in Tel Aviv earlier this month pointed out via her placard in Hebrew, we were silent about occupation and we ended up with dictatorship. Donald Trump thrives on continually shocking people. He does it so much that you can get numb to it. On the one hand, it's like, oh yeah, it's Trump. What do you expect from him? On the other hand, I don't think we should lose our capacity to be shocked. And what happened this weekend was truly shocking, even by Trump standards. The former president of the United States stood on a stage and glorified domestic terrorists. He made a song with the so-called J6 prison choir. Yes, that is a real thing. Actual January the 6th insurrectionists in prison singing together. Trump played that song, which you are hearing right now, at the beginning of his rally. And to top it all off, he did all this on a stage in Waco, Texas. Yes, the site of that deadly standoff between law enforcement and a heavily armed cult group 30 years ago. It remains a powerful symbol of government overreach for right-wing extremists even today. But of course, Trump's fans in the crowd, they lapped it all up on Saturday. New York Times opinion columnist Charles Blow saw the reaction for himself in Waco this weekend and writes that, quote, this is part of what makes Trump so dangerous. For some, the extreme fandom creates community. For others, Trump worship could inspire violent fanaticism, as we saw on January the 6th, 2021. Joining me now is New York Times columnist Charles Blow. Thank you for coming on the show tonight. Today, Charles, on Fox, Brian Kilmeade had some harsh words for Trump's use of the January 6 rioters as a campaign opener. Have a listen.
The former president of the United States opened up with January 6 video, which is insane. He should be running from that, period. I don't care his point of view. That is not a good thing for him. I thought that was absolutely awful. Even though he is winning in the polls, that will not help.
Now, Charles, we know a lot of Fox hosts are, leaning towards the DeSantis camp, and there's a kind of self-serving nature to these kind of criticisms. But it's still, even a Fox host think you went too far. You probably went too far.
Yes, but, I think Trump is operating on multiple levels here. Legally, it's dumb. Morally, it's repugnant. For the people who like him, though, this is part of the thing. The whole catch me if you can, bruh rabbit thing. The more times it looks like he's trapped and he finds some way to wiggle his way out of it, it actually adds to the legend of Trump. And so for him to lean into the thing that he is being pursued about for that audience actually is on brand for him.
Yeah. It's a very good point. And Charles, you also write in your piece, quote, after Trump's speech, I went back to listen to his first speech after announcing his candidacy in 2015. The tone and themes were strikingly similar. He hasn't grown much personally or politically since then. He's more sure of himself and more vulgar, but narcissism is still his engine. Ultimately, if his legal issues don't do him in, his inability to grow beyond nostalgia and negativity could. And I agree with a lot of that, but I also think, and I want to get your take here, when you look at Trump in 2015, 2016, and even look at him in 2020, he's playing footsie with a lot of the extremists now that he's openly in bed with. He was playing footsie with QAnon in 2020. Now he's openly QAnon. He was kind of playing footsie with Holocaust deniers. Now he has Holocaust deniers over for dinner. So he has ramped it up even since leaving the office.
Yeah, I think that is true. However, the difference between 2016 and now is the appetite in the country is different. We were pre-pandemic.
Yes.
We were right. We were before the height of Black Lives Matter. We were coming out of Obama. People were looking for something different, some contrast to Obama in some ways. All those things were true, and he was novel at the time. This guy breaking into the big time into playing politics, and he's a comedian in a way. He's an entertainer in a way. There's a novelty to it in 2016 that simply did not exist in 2020 and certainly does not exist in 2024.
That's a very good point. I always think to myself, the 2016 Trump voters, I give them the benefit of the doubt at the very minimum. They thought, give him a chance. Just try him out. It's the 2020 voters who voted for him again after watching 4 years of those car crashes, and I will never understand. Let me ask you this, Charles. If John Kerry had stood on a stage in 2004 and glorified the 9/11 hijackers, or even better, if Barack Obama had stood on a stage with a bunch of black convicted criminals and sung a song in 2008, how would the GOP, how would conservatives in this country have responded?
I think Trump's base measures him by a different standard. It's not by the standard of a conventional politician. They look at him as an entertainer. They look at him as something of a wry comedian. And we may think of that comedy as puerile and vulgar, it may be dripping in racism and sexism and misogyny, but for them, that is precisely what they like. And like with any other comedian, they don't necessarily have to abide by the truth. They can just stretch it as long as it's funny and entertaining. It works. They don't have to abide by kind of conventional rules of decorum as long as it works and it's funny, it's entertaining. There's a lot of people, and I don't think we kind of capture this enough, who are simply entertained by the man. And they love the fact, added to the entertainment, that quotient, that he also has the power to advocate and fight for causes that they like.
I mean, we all know that if he had not hosted The Apprentice, he would not have been president of the United States. There's an inextricable link between those two things. Let me ask you this. You mentioned entertaining. You mentioned his ability to entertain, which is undeniable. Is that the reason why Ron DeSantis is failing to make a dent in the Trump lead? In fact, is going down in the polls because DeSantis just doesn't have the ability to entertain. He has no charisma whatsoever. He's a very wooden politician and performer, as we saw last week, even taking softballs from Piers Morgan. He gets battered for, having U-turns on Ukraine in a way that Donald Trump doesn't. He's held to a different standard. Is that DeSantis' biggest problem, do you think?
Well, there is the circling of the wagons around Trump whenever he gets in trouble. That happens with his base. And so I think that part of that is showing up in the polls. But in addition, there is the thing that you're talking about. DeSantis is not an entertainer, so you can't be judged by that standard. So he's judged by the conventional politician standard, and he's a horrible politician. And so there's no part of him that actually shines. And when that doesn't happen, he cannot get ahead. And also, he refuses to engage Trump directly, even though Trump continues to engage him directly. So for that base, it looks like someone who is a fighter up against someone who is not a fighter.
Someone who's not a fighter, and also someone who seems like they have a glass jaw. I, for one, will get my popcorn ready for any Trump-DeSantis presidential primary debate on stage. That one I will not miss, I'll tell you that. Charles Blow, appreciate your reporting from Waco. Appreciate your column. Appreciate you. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
That is all in on this Monday night.
The battle over a woman's right to choose, global economic challenges, the ongoing threat to democracy. When you sign up for the MSNBC Daily Newsletter, you're signing up to have a deeper understanding of today's biggest issues. Every morning you'll get insightful articles sent directly to your inbox, written by people you know and trust, like Hayes Brown and Mehdi Hassan, along with video highlights from your favorite MSNBC shows. Sign up for MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.